A world 10 years in the making. One filled with heroes and legends from all over the globe, whose stories have been reinvented for modern day, that makes us believe that there truly is a whole universe out there, just waiting to be explored. It's the epitome of what good world building should do, and it's why in this episode of The Storyteller's Notebook, a series in which I analyze various storytelling techniques used by various creators and various mediums, I want to talk about American Gods, specifically the 10th anniversary edition of the original novel and its approach to world building. I mean, you read the title, right? Oh, spoilers by the way, for the book, and though I'm not explicitly talking about it, the TV series. American Gods is a fantasy novel by Neil Gaiman, published in 2001, set in a world where gods and mythological beings are real, and are created and feed off of people's belief in them. The story follows Shadow Moon, a convict released from prison early on account of his wife's sudden death, who takes up a job as a bodyguard for a mysterious grifter called Mr. Wednesday, and quickly becomes embroiled in a battle between gods both old and new as they fight for the heart and soul of modern America. It's a rich and fascinating novel whose themes of deception, betrayal, identity, and immigration are ever relevant, especially nowadays in our current political climate. And while it does have its problems, something I hope the TV series has worked on, since even though I'm using footage from it to make editing this a lot easier, I admittedly haven't properly watched the TV series yet. I'm sorry. One of the things this novel does amazingly well is its world building. It blends together myths, legends, and cultural icons from all over the world with a contemporary American setting in such a way that's down to earth, surreal, and epic, as if this tale of warring gods is just one of many playing out in this mythical no man's land. A lot of this comes from the story's strong sense of history. Each of the gods, as well as having their own mythologies to draw from, also have their own unique backstories about how they ended up in America. Mr. Wednesday, who we learn is actually the Norse god Odin, arrived in America in 813 AD alongside Tyr and Thor after a longboat of Vikings landed in America, and hung a local Native American man in sacrifice to them, before being slaughtered by said sacrifice's tribe in revenge. Matt Sweeney, a leprechaun from Ireland, came across the Atlantic in the mind of a girl from Bantry Bay trying to escape the Great Famine. Ibis, Jackal, and Bast, who are the Egyptian gods Thoth, Anubis, and Bastet, respectively, ended up in America after the ancient Egyptians established a trade route with Native Americans thousands of years ago, and stayed long enough for their beliefs to stick. The Coming to America chapters each build upon this history, similarly showing how various mythical figures arrived in America in their own strange ways. From the Cornish pixie who ended up in America because of a kleptomaniac girl banished from Britain and her belief in fairy folk, to the mammoth god, Nunyanini, who led his tribe across the barren snows of the Bering Land Bridge to the New World, only to be forgotten when said tribe was conquered by a more powerful one many generations later. It even shows that there are many incarnations of these gods all across the world, with how Mamaji mentions that there's a version of her back in India doing better than her, and the fact that Shadow runs into another version of Odin in Reykjavik, Iceland in the postscript. And as a side note, the extra chapters often use their prose to show that they exist independently of the narrative. The Somewhere in America chapters are written in present tense to emphasize the feeling of them happening right now, somewhere in America. And the Coming to America chapters use run-on lines in italic that show Mr. Ibis' actions as he writes these tales before flowing back into the prose. The important thing to understand about American history, wrote Mr. Ibis in his leather-bound journal, is that it is fictional. It is a fine fiction, he continued, pausing to dip his pen in the inkwell, collect his thoughts, and continue. The dense lore and background behind these gods and goddesses, as well as the extra stories independent of the main plot, strengthens and reinforces the idea that this is a world that has and does exist beyond the bounds of the main story, and will continue to long after it comes to a close. And the book takes pride in exploring this world as much as it can, showing off all sorts of interesting places, usually based on real locations, and all kinds of quirky characters that give the world a distinct sense of identity. From the hustle and bustle of big cities like Las Vegas and San Francisco, to the dozens of small towns dotted across the South, Midwest, and far north, like Cairo or Eagle Point, to places like the House on the Rock, a tourist trap so bizarre in its history and design that Gaiman said he had to, quote, tone it down a bit so people would believe it. In a fantasy novel about gods and monsters, and you get the point, the House on the Rock is a weird place. They all highlight a grandiose mythicality to the American landscape that builds on the book's fantasy focus. Likewise, the novel's characters reveal the varying lifestyles of this world's inhabitants. Some of the gods, like Chernobog and the Zorya sisters, are just about getting by, living off a combination of Chernobog's pension from the slaughterhouse where he used to work, and the extra cash the Zoryas are able to bring in through fortune-telling. Others, like the man in the grey suit and Easter, are able to live quite well, with the man in the grey suit feeding off the money and time people sacrifice to his casino, and Easter living off the fact that people still celebrate her holiday, even though no one knows who she actually is. And others still, like the new gods, do manage to thrive, but at a cost. There was an arrogance to the new ones. Shadow could see that. But there was also a fear. They were afraid that unless they kept pace with a changing world, that unless they remade and redrew and rebuilt the world in their image, their time would already be over. Through the world's locations and characters, we understand that this is a vast and mythical world, and one whose people struggle in one way or another, doing their best to get to the next day or desperately doing everything in their power to stay relevant. It gives the novel's setting a lived-in vibe and establishes a consistent tone that makes it stand out. But for as important as all this lore and scenery is, what makes it all click together is the fact that it's all in service of the story. As you can probably guess from what I've talked about so far, there are several thematic through lines in the world of American gods. The old gods, gods of the harvest, of justice, and of death, have been forgotten by the people who brought them to America, replaced by new ones, gods of opinion, of media, and of the internet. Similarly, many of the small towns Shadow visits across America are either spiraling into poverty, being abandoned, or being consumed by corporate interests. 3 years had passed. Yes, the Super A motel had gone, torn down. In its place was a Wendy's. There were more stoplights, unfamiliar storefronts. There are too many towns hereabouts that exist only for hunters and vacationers. Towns that just take their money and send them home with their trophies and their bug bites. Then there are the company towns, where everything's just hunky-dory until Walmart relocates their distribution center, or 3M stops manufacturing CD cases there or whatever. And suddenly there's a boatload of people who can't pay their mortgage. LINKZ, the small northern town Shadow spends several chapters hiding out in, seems to be the only small town that's doing well, and even then, it's only because of the sacrifices that Hinselman, a nice old man everyone in town is friends with, takes from it every year. He is an old god, himself created through sacrifice, desperately clinging to his power. At the same time, the book's characters have a strong knack for deception and betrayal. Shadow is quite proficient at coin tricks, an art built around misdirection and deception. Whilst Shadow was in prison, his wife, Laura, had an affair with his best friend, betraying his trust. Mr. Wednesday earns his money by scamming people, a point made abundantly clear with his bank robbery in Chapter 5. Mr. World, the mysterious leader of the Men in Black and the head of the new god's forces, turns out to be none other than Loki, the infamous Norse god of trickery and deception himself. And in the end, it turns out that Mr. Wednesday and Loki had been working together to stoke the flames of war between the gods, which they could then use to increase their power, betraying and deceiving not only Shadow, but also all the gods who had put their utmost trust and faith in them. Meanwhile, there's also a focus in the idea of people finding a way to reinvent themselves. Many of the supplementary stories focus on immigrants trying to build a new life for themselves in America, and even Shadow is an ex-convict doing his best to move on after his wife's death. It's a world that is constantly changing, that's quick to adapt, and where the downtrodden and miserable have the opportunity to completely turn their lives around. But at the same time, this is a world where people ignore their problems and let them fester and grow in this land that is so bad for gods. The world, while feeling vast and expansive, is built to reflect and reinforce the novel's core themes and ideas. American Gods' approach to world building is to essentially treat its world like a character in its own right, which is ironic given that in the novel America itself is also a god, but that's it, the whole thing. The world has its own backstory, its own identity, its own relatable struggles and conflicts, and most importantly, it plays a part in the narrative. It's a strange and yet creatively simple idea to give a world, and by extension the story it's been built for, an extra layer of personality. And yeah, those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think, if you agree, disagree, if you're a fan of Neil Gaiman's work, or Gaiman, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, what your thoughts on world building are, etc, and thanks for watching. Also, let me know what you thought of the style of this video. I'm trying something new and I want to get some feedback. If you enjoyed this and want to see more, then check out my last video, a Q&A I did to celebrating 1,000 subscribers, which, again, thank you. Or check out the last episode of the Storyteller's Notebook. And don't forget to like, comment, share, and of course, subscribe to come fly with me. You can also follow me on Twitter for more updates about this channel and other stuff, and hopefully, I'll see you later.